The summer I turned 29, I came home with a titanium rod in my left femur, a medical discharge in my back pocket, and $41 in checking. My mother didn't come to the airport. My sister sent a text. It said, "Safe travels." Like I was on a work trip. Like I hadn't spent the last 8 months in a military hospital learning how to walk in a straight line again. The taxi driver helped me with my bag. He didn't ask questions. He just handed it to me at the curb like it was the most ordinary thing in the world, and I stood on the sidewalk outside the house where I grew up and I thought, something is wrong here and it isn't the leg. What I didn't know yet, what I wouldn't understand for almost 3 years, was that a decision had already been made. While I was in Germany doing physical therapy, my family had a different conversation. A quiet one. About property. About inheritance. About a very old man on the far end of the county who kept bees and drove a 1987 pickup truck, and who, apparently, had more to say about my future than anyone told me. What he left behind was not what anyone expected. Welcome to Family Revenge Stories New. This channel is about family, money, and the moment you stop explaining yourself to people who were never listening. If you're new here, hit subscribe, and drop in the comments where you're listening from. I want to know who's out there. My grandfather's name was Harold Eugene Marsh. Everyone called him Gene. He was 74 years old when I came home, and he had been keeping bees in the back half of his property since 1979. He had 43 hives the summer I arrived. He knew the number without counting. He walked the rows the way some men walk a familiar street, hands in his pockets, not looking down. He wore the same 4 things in rotation: khaki work pants, a gray long-sleeve undershirt, red wing boots that he resoled himself, and a canvas jacket with a tear in the left elbow that he had safety pinned shut sometime around 2004 and never bothered to sew. He drove the '87 Silverado. It had no working air conditioning and a crack in the windshield that started at the passenger corner and had crept over 15 years almost to the center. He refused to fix it because, his words, "It's not in my line of sight." He didn't spend money on things that weren't in his line of sight. He owned 40 acres, a farmhouse, the bee operation, and a dry goods structure he rented to a neighbor for extra storage. He had no mortgage. He had no credit card. He paid for everything with a paper check from a checkbook he kept in the glove compartment of that truck, tucked under an owner's manual and a flashlight that worked. The arrangement between Jean and my aunt, my father's sister Renata, had been in place for about 6 years by the time I came home. Renata lived 40 minutes away. She had been designated, by a handshake and a letter that was not a legal document, as Jean's primary caretaker. She received a monthly payment for this. $300, later raised to $500. She took him to his cardiology appointments. She picked up his prescriptions. She filed his taxes. She told the extended family she basically lived out there. She did not. I would learn in time how often she actually visited. But I didn't know that yet. What Jean said to me, the first afternoon I sat on his porch with a glass of iced tea and my leg propped on a cooler, was this: "A bee doesn't care who owns the field. She goes where the flowers are." I thought he was being poetic. He wasn't. He was telling me something exact. My life at that moment was not a story I would have volunteered. I had separated from the military 11 weeks earlier. The injury, a vehicle accident during a training exercise, not combat, which felt important in ways I couldn't explain, had ended a career I had organized my entire adult life around. I had no civilian job history. I had no college degree. I had savings of about $4,000, which sounds like something until you understand that physical therapy wasn't fully covered and I'd had 2 copays a week for the better part of a year. I was renting a room in my cousin Marcus's basement in town. $70 a week, utilities included. The ceiling was low enough that I had to angle my shoulders through the door frame. I went to Jean's because Marcus suggested it. The old man could use help and it gets you out of the basement. And because I had nowhere else to be, and because something about 40 acres and 43 beehives sounded like the opposite of a fluorescent hospital ceiling, I almost didn't go. That first Sunday, I sat in the car in his driveway for 11 minutes before I got out. I'm glad I got out of the car. The betrayal didn't announce itself. It arrived the way cold does, not all at once but room by room. It was a Tuesday in October. About 6 weeks after I'd started coming out to help Jean regularly. I was in town for a PT appointment, and I stopped by my mother's house, which is also where Renata happened to be that afternoon, which I did not know until I was already through the door. They were at the kitchen table. The conversation stopped when I walked in. Not paused, stopped. The specific kind of stop that tells you your name was the last word spoken. My mother offered me coffee. Renata smiled with her mouth. I sat down. I said I'd been spending time with Jean, helping with the hives, driving him to one appointment when Renata had a conflict. Renata said, "That's sweet." She said it like she was handing back something I'd accidentally dropped, like it cost her nothing because it didn't. Then my mother said, and she said this gently in the voice she used when she believed she was helping, "Jessie, don't get your hopes up about the property. Jean has a plan for it. Renata's been doing the heavy lifting for years. It wouldn't be fair." I hadn't said anything about property. I hadn't thought about property. I was trying to learn how to split a hive without getting stung. I didn't say that. I said, "I'm just helping out." I finished the coffee. I drove back to Jean's. I didn't mention the conversation to him. I fed the new colonies along the south fence. I wrote down the queen status in the notebook Jean kept on the shelf by the barn door. I drove home to the basement. I had been told plainly that I was not in the story. I decided to stay anyway. From November through the following August, I reorganized my entire life around 40 acres and one old man. Jean had a cardiologist in the city, a GP in town, a dentist he hadn't seen in 4 years, and a prescription situation that required monthly reconciliation because he had 4 different drugs from 3 different doctors and one of them had been duplicated without anyone noticing. I noticed. I started keeping a spreadsheet. Appointment dates, prescription fill dates, copay amounts, which I sometimes covered when Jean's check was slower than the pharmacy. I did not tell him I was covering them. I just paid and noted it and told myself I'd sort it later. I never sorted it. I stopped trying. I was freelancing by then. Logistics consulting, which is a term that means I made spreadsheets for small businesses that couldn't afford a real operations manager. I did it from Jean's kitchen table most days, on a laptop that had a battery that lasted 40 minutes before it needed to be plugged in. I ran a power strip from the outlet behind the refrigerator. Jean would sit across from me reading. He read a lot. History mostly. He had opinions about Grant that he would share whether you were ready for them or not. Renata came out once in November, once in February, once in April. I know the dates because I was there for 2 of the 3 visits and Jean told me about the 3rd. He didn't say anything pointed about it. He just said, "Renata came by yesterday," and went back to his book. At Thanksgiving at my mother's table, Renata talked about Jean's care like it was a full-time second job. She described driving him to a cardiology appointment in September with a level of detail that suggested proximity. She had a story about his medication that she told like she had discovered it. I had sent her an email about that medication issue in August. She had not replied. I thought about saying something. I looked at my mother's face, the way she was looking at Renata with that particular expression, the one that meant she's so devoted, and I decided the table wasn't the field I wanted to fight on. I said, "The rolls are good, Mom." She said she tried a new recipe. That was the right thing to do. I knew it then and I know it now. What I want to tell you is what Jean and I started that winter when the hives went quiet. Every year after the last honey pull, Jean spent the cold months doing 2 things. Reading his history books and writing letters to the families of veterans in the county who had died by suicide. He had done this since 1987. He had a list, kept in a green address book, small enough to fit in a jacket pocket, of 61 names. He sent a letter every year on the anniversary of the death. Not a sympathy card. A real letter. He wrote them by hand. He didn't tell me about this. I found out because I saw a stack of envelopes on the counter one morning and asked, and he told me plainly the way he told me most things. That winter I started helping him write them. I can't tell you why exactly. Maybe because I knew some of those names or knew names that would eventually be on lists like that one. We sat at the kitchen table. He dictated. I typed. He signed. He said one evening, when we were nearly done with the January batch, "Jessie, when something's yours, You'll know because it'll still be there after everyone who wanted it is gone. I wrote it down. I didn't know why. I wrote it in the same notebook where I logged hive conditions. If you've ever quietly carried something heavier than your bank account for someone who deserved it, who just deserved it, drop the word bees in the comments and subscribe, because this does not end where you think it ends. In March of the second year, I found an envelope. It was in the glove compartment of the truck. I'd been looking for the registration. Jean needed it for something, I don't remember what, and my hand closed around it before I realized what it was. It was a sealed envelope. My name was on the front. Jean's handwriting. I held it for a long time. I put it back. I pushed the owner's manual back on top of it. I found the registration behind the sun visor. I brought it inside and handed it to Jean and did not say anything about the envelope. He looked at me for a moment in the way he had level, unhurried. Then he said, "You'll drive me Thursday." Not a question. An appointment had been made. I said, "What time?" 8, he said. I wrote it in the notebook. Thursday was his attorney's office in town. I drove him. I waited in the truck. I read a book on my phone for 2 hours. He came out carrying a manila folder, which he put in the back seat, not the front. He said, "Good. That's done." He said, "You want breakfast?" We went to the diner on Route 9. He had eggs. I had a short stack. He paid with a paper check. He said nothing about the folder. I asked nothing about the folder. Whatever was mine, I had decided would still be there after everyone who wanted it was gone. That spring was the best season the hives ever had. A bloom event, Jean said. A convergence of flowering times that only happened every several years when the clover and the black locust and the tulip poplar all opened within days of each other. The bees worked in a kind of frenzy that Jean said wasn't frenzy at all, just purpose, just the purest version of what a bee was built to do. We pulled more honey that summer than he had in a decade. He gave jars to neighbors. He gave jars to his doctor's office staff. He gave a case to the VFW in town for a raffle. One evening we were labeling jars on the porch. Jean had a hand stamp and a roll of craft paper labels, all of it wonderfully low-tech, and he said out of nowhere, "The letters mean more than the money." Always did. I said, "What letters?" He looked at me with a patience that was also a little bit of something else. "The ones we write," he said. "The ones in the book." I nodded. He went back to labeling. That was July. He died in September. I knew before I opened the door. It was a Saturday. I'd been out to check the hives. There was a queen failure in Colony 12 that I'd been monitoring, and I came back to the house and the light above the kitchen sink was on, which it always was when Jean was awake and moving, and the truck was in the drive and everything looked exactly right. But there was a quality to the silence that wasn't ordinary silence. On the counter by the sink was his coffee mug. Washed. Turned upside down on the drying rack. He'd gotten up. Made his coffee. Washed the mug. Gone back to bed. That was who he was. I called the ambulance first. Then I called Jean's doctor. Then I called Renata. She picked up on the second ring. The first thing she said was, "Did he say anything about the property?" The funeral was at the Methodist church he'd attended for 50 years. He had a lot of friends. Farmers mostly, and the doctor's office staff and several veterans, some of whom I recognized and some I didn't. The VFW sent a detail. Renata wore black. She cried through the whole service in a way that was genuine and also somehow aware of its audience. She held hands with my mother in the front pew. She spoke to people in the receiving line with that particular cadence of "we were so close, I was so devoted," and she repeated the same 2 stories enough times that they stopped sounding like memories and started sounding like a statement. I stood to one side and watched and didn't say anything. There was a woman I didn't recognize, maybe 60, in a gray blazer, with glasses and the particular posture of someone professionally accustomed to delivering information calmly. She introduced herself quietly, without ceremony. She pressed a business card into my hand. The name on the card was Patricia Ellison. Below that, in smaller print, attorney at law. She looked at me for a moment, not long, just long enough, and gave a small nod. The kind of nod that means, "I'll see you at the table. There's something you don't know yet." I put the card in my pocket. I went back to the receiving line. I shook hands with a man who said Jean had lent him a tractor in 1994, And that was just who Jean was. That was exactly who Jean was. The reading was 12 days after the funeral, in Patricia Ellison's office on the second floor of a building downtown. Wood-paneled. Smelled like old paper and window unit air conditioning. Renata arrived before me. She was already seated when I walked in, and she had brought my mother, which Patricia had not invited but also did not address. Renata had a leather tote bag on her lap. She looked settled. She looked like someone who had already run the numbers. She said quietly to my mother, just loud enough to travel, "This is mostly just procedure." Jean was very clear with me about his intentions. Patricia sat at the head of the table. She arranged her papers without hurry. She began. Jean's estate was larger than anyone in that room knew. The house, the 40 acres, and the bee operation were valued at approximately $410,000. There was also a brokerage account, modest, conservative, mostly index funds he had been adding to since 1991, totaling $237,000. Renata shifted in her chair. Patricia read a passage from the document in Jean's own language. Jean had written portions of his will in his own words, which Patricia said he had specifically requested. The passage she read was this: "The money paid to Renata over the years of this arrangement was recorded as an advance against her portion of this estate, and is so designated in the accounting attached hereto. I kept good records. I always kept good records." In the attached accounting, 6 pages of a ledger in Jean's handwriting, the monthly payments to Renata over 6 years, totaling somewhere above $38,000, were listed as an advance. Not a gift. An advance. Renata went very still. Then she said, "That's not what he told me." Her voice was even. Then she said louder, "That's not what we agreed." Then she said, at a volume the hallway could probably hear. She was there for 5 minutes. "I gave up years. I gave up years of my life and this." Patricia said, "Miss Calloway." Renata said, "She manipulated him. Everybody could see it. An old man and she just." I stood up. I did not raise my voice. I want to be clear about that. What I said was, Jean washed his own mug the morning he died. He made his own decisions every day until the last one. That's who he was. I think most of the people in this room already know that. I looked once at my mother. Just once. Then I picked up my bag and walked out. I stood in the parking lot for a while in the September heat, next to Jean's truck, which Patricia had told me privately was specifically bequeathed to me, crack in the windshield and all. I didn't feel like celebrating. I thought about the mug on the drying rack. I thought, he knew I'd be the one to find him. He washed it anyway because that was the kind of man he was and he didn't need an audience for it. Renata contested. Her attorney sent a letter. Patricia responded. 3 months later, Renata's attorney withdrew the contest. I was told it was because of the ledger. Jean had kept records going back to the first payment. 6 years of documentation, every check, every date, every amount, all of it in that steady handwriting in a brown ledger he kept in the barn office. He had known for a very long time that a ledger might be needed. My mother called me 6 weeks after the reading. She said she hadn't understood everything that had been happening. She said she thought Renata had been more present than she was. She said she was sorry. I believed her. She was trying to make sense of something that had been curated for her. That's not a crime. I told her I'd like to have dinner sometime. Renata's public version of herself, the devoted caretaker, the one who gave up years, did not survive that conference room. Word travels in a county. People who had heard the story from her side had also seen the parking lot or heard about it or compared notes with someone who had. When the ledger became the story, there was no room left for the other version. She went quiet. That's all I'll say. Jean and I had talked that last winter about what to do with honey that wouldn't sell. He had a problem common to small bee operations. More product than market. Some years he had 50-60 extra pounds that just sat. He said once, "Be ashamed to waste it on me. I've got enough." I had an idea. He listened to it. He said, "Write it down." I wrote it in the notebook on the same page as the hive conditions for Colony 12. The following spring, with a portion of what Jean left, I formalized the idea. The Jean Marsh Apiary Fund operates out of a partnership with the County Veterans Services Organization. Every year it provides small stipends, nothing dramatic, $200 to $500, to veterans in occupational transition who need to cover a copay, a certification fee, a tool, or a tank of gas to get to a job interview. Practical things. The kind of things that are small enough to be embarrassing to ask for and large enough to derail everything. It also provides, free of charge, access to beekeeping equipment for veterans who want to learn. There's a waiting list. The bees don't care who you were before you came to them. They just want you to be calm and slow and present. Jean would say that's true of most things worth doing. The green address book is on my desk. I still write the letters. I write them by hand now, not typed. His handwriting was better than mine, but I'm working on it. The coffee mug is on the shelf above my kitchen sink. Cream-colored, one small chip on the handle, no special markings. I don't use it for coffee. I don't know exactly why. The envelope from the glove compartment, the one I found and put back, was included in a packet Patricia gave me at the reading. I opened it that night. It said, "You put it back." That's why. That's all it said. The Silverado is in my driveway. The crack in the windshield has crept another half-inch toward center. I'm not going to fix it. It's not in my line of sight. I would trade it. The property, the fund, the truck, the legal victory, all of it, I would trade it for one more ordinary Tuesday. One more morning at the kitchen table, him reading about Grant, me on the laptop arguing with a spreadsheet, the bees doing whatever bees do in the fields beyond the window. That's the thing they don't tell you about being right. Being right is cold comfort in an empty kitchen. What I know is this. Jean showed up for me when he didn't have to, and I showed up for him when I wasn't asked to, and neither of us made a speech about it. We just did the work. That's the whole story. If there's someone in your life who has shown up quietly, without an audience, without keeping score, call them. Don't send a text. Call them. While you can. If this story landed somewhere true for you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you're new. And I'll see you in the next one.